Welcome back to a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. It is Thursday, July 2nd, 2015. A belated Happy Canada Day to all our viewers up north, and an early Happy 4th of July to all our viewers here in America. So much to talk about on today's show. Of course, we're going to be talking about Chad Mendes replacing Jose Aldo at UFC 189, the new Reebok Fight Kit, which was unveiled this week in New York City. Josh Koscheck signing with Bellator and a whole lot more, so let us get right into it. Today, we're being joined by the A-Team. Good to have you guys back. Chuck, we missed you, although Mike Chiappetta did a great job last week, I should say.
He did well. He did a good job. I watched.
Good to have you back.
Good job? You mean a great job.
He did a good job.
Just a good job. That is Luke Thomas of MMAfighting.com and the SiriusXM Fight Club. That is Jeff Wagenheim of SportsIllustrated.com. And of course, that is Chuck Mindenhall, also of MMAfighting.com. All right, guys, let's talk about the big news. It has to be Chad Mendes replacing Jose Aldo. That's the news of the week. It might end up being the news of the year in some ways because of all the money the UFC spent on promoting Aldo versus McGregor. We find out on Tuesday night that it's not going to be that fight. It's going to be an interim title fight. It's going to be Mendes versus McGregor. Of all the fight cancellations over the past couple of years, all the heartbreak, all the bummers, does this one sting the most?
Oh, I hadn't even thought of it that way. Wow. No. It's bad, but it's not lost forever, right? So, for example, we were talking about this before the show. This is a crazy, crazy moment still. Because if Conor McGregor wins, the universe goes this way. If Conor McGregor loses, and let's say loses badly, the whole universe goes that way. In other words, there's still stakes. And provided McGregor wins, we still get the fight that we want with Aldo. So it is potentially disastrous, because if Mendes wins, oh my God. I mean, the sport will look different if Mendes goes in there and just hammers him into a TKO stoppage, let's say in the second or third round. So it is potentially disappointing if we lose everything. But this is like a giant coin flip. This is the UFC doubling down on the bet. And if they win the bet, it gets even better. So I'm not ready to declare disaster yet. I'm ready to say, let's see what happens. Is it red or is it black?
A positive take. Pretty surprising right off the bat.
I am a grumpy person.
Yeah, I'm sort of blown away. But no, and I'm having a hard time imagining myself saying this right now, but it would have been worse if the other guy had fallen out. If McGregor had fallen out of this fight, if the challenger had dropped out of the fight, not the champion, whole thing would have fallen apart. Because, face it, this is the Conor McGregor show. It has been ever since it began. No disrespect intended toward Jose Aldo. He's a champion. He's the greatest featherweight ever. But this has been the McGregor show right from the start. And you know what? This is sort of the fight that a lot of us wanted to see from the get-go. Other than the fact that it's incredibly short notice, but it's short notice for both guys. This is the fight that I certainly wanted to see to really get a good sense of where McGregor is.
Yeah, I think that it's a strange setup because it has been labeled sort of McGregor. This whole time it's been all about McGregor. Aldo, we know what Aldo can do, so it's a guy who's going to come up and get in his face and poke the bear a little bit, and that's sort of where we've been through this whole thing. What I like about it is that McGregor didn't hesitate to even take a fight like this, given the stakes of what we're talking about. I mean, it's not an exact thing, but he's an underdog in this fight. McGregor becomes an underdog in this fight, which is an interesting sort of concept, considering how much hype he's bringing into this fight. It's almost as if Bethe Correia couldn't go and they said Cyborg is going to step in. It would be almost like that. Of course, Bethe Correia is not Jose Aldo, but it's that sort of risk factor, and I agree with you 100%. It's like, if Chad Mendes is to win this fight, it becomes a completely different landscape. We talked about how the UFC needs stars. Well, they've got a star, and you're putting him into a very vulnerable situation. And I think it's sort of admirable, first of all, for McGregor to just be like, yeah, I don't care. I'll do this fight regardless, whoever it is. It doesn't matter to me. And it's a risk by the UFC that it reminds you that they really do, I think, at heart, try to put the guy that they think can beat the other guy. I don't think that they do too many gimmies in situations where it's like a main event.
And you mentioned poking the bear, and there's been a lot of poking. I mean, Conor McGregor has been poking Jose Aldo like crazy in the build-up to this. But could you imagine what the poking will look like a week from Sunday? If he goes out there and beats Mendes, now he's poking while he has a big gold belt over his shoulder. Now he's also poking by saying, well, you were afraid to fight me. You dropped out of the fight. So we ain't seen nothing yet. If McGregor wins the fight, we ain't seen nothing yet.
Not just like, but running away and maybe never coming back. They're like hinting that he may retire after this humiliation and all this stuff. It's an interesting thing.
And it's good that Aldo finally spoke yesterday. He referred to that interim title as a toy belt, and the feud continues. But I want to ask you about the McGregor show, as you put it, and I agree 100%. The gate for this card is around 7 million. Sold out. It's been that way for the past several months. If this was announced from the get-go as Conor McGregor fighting Chad Mendes, belt or no belt, main event, July 4th weekend, International Fight Week, do you still think they get to that $7 million gate? Do you still think they sell it out right away as well?
Sell it out right away. I don't know about they get a $7 million gate, but reconsider everyone from a competitive standpoint. What was Conor McGregor versus Dennis Seaver? Basura, nothing. I mean, it was a setup fight. Let's just call it what it is. And he went in there and did exactly what we thought he was going to do. That peaked at over 3 million people on Fox Sports 1. I mean, that's not the high end of what the Women's World Cup is doing, but it's, competitive, right? And they're doing gangbuster ratings, right? And then on Fight Pass, when he fought Diego Brandao, that's, I think, for MMA fighting, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think as an all-time traffic record for a Fight Pass event. So, people will tune in for him, to your point, no matter what. Is that the same kind of special magic as a title fight against this rival after a world tour? Probably not, but he can sell out the MGM Grand, if that's what you're asking. Shadow boxing. Having a nice opponent like Jose Aldo means you can raise the ticket prices.
Do you have any problem with them making this the main event? I saw some people nitpicking about it. I mean, again, you referred to this as the McGregor show. And it's a weird thing because I don't necessarily think the interim title needs to even be at play here. I understand why they're doing it. It really justifies them leaving this as the main event. But let's be honest. I mean, everyone's coming. It's righting the wrong that they did at UFC 178, right? They put Demetrius and Carriasso as the main event, and I think that card suffered pay-per-view wise. Do you have any problem with them leaving this as the main event?
I've had a change of heart about this stuff. I think that there was a time when the UFC had that thing where they would always have the heavier weight title fight above the lighter weight title fight if there were two title fights on the card, and that there was a sort of an established hierarchy. And I always supported that. But the more I think about it, the more I start to see how they're promoting things differently. It's really about what you can sell. I mean, to me, what should never be what it should never get away from is making the right fights and giving people title fights when they deserve those fights. But as far as where they put the things on the card, it really doesn't matter to me.
Do you have a problem with the interim title even being at play here?
Not really. I mean, ultimately, we've seen sort of Conor McGregor's treatment through this whole process, and I just feel like, he's going around in private jets and everything he's been doing. I feel like the UFC has made no secret that they really love Conor McGregor, and to me, it's like if he has a symbol on his shoulder, if he's able to win it, it just makes for a bigger fight. And I know that's why they wanted to kind of expedite him into a title fight to begin with. He changes everything. He's the star that they've been trying to find. There haven't been as many stars as there once were coming up through the ranks, and he just happens to be that guy. He has a new market that he's bringing. It's not a new market, but it's a market that he's turning into a hotbed. Just by himself. And, he said he could sell out a stadium on his own. I believe him. I think that he could sell out. If anybody on the roster could do that, I believe he could sell out a stadium. So ultimately, I think that you want to put him in a fight where he can win a symbol like that, even if it's for the interim. And it does, like you mentioned, it sets up an even more colossal fight with Aldo once he does come back.
Last week on the show, while this was all up in the air, I said it had to be, McGregor versus a broomstick because you had all these people coming from Ireland who had already purchased tickets, planned vacations, etc. But now that it's a reality, now that he is actually fighting Chad Mendes and we know Chad's skill set, is the UFC truly playing with fire here? Do you think they may come back to actually regret this because if he loses, that Aldo fight goes away?
This is an interesting question I've been thinking about because if you look at the history of the UFC, not just from a matchmaking position, although that too, but from business calculations, they're very diligent and responsible about making calculated gambles. And not all of them work, but many of them do. It's amazing when you go back and sort of trace their history. You want to call it a lucky break, but the UFC always bets on themselves to win. Or I should say routinely bets on themselves to win, and they usually make really smart plays about when they're going to do that so that they rarely lose in those circumstances. This seems to be slightly outside of that, which isn't to say they will lose. This is a high risk, high reward, because if Mendes wins, I don't think he's necessarily going to absorb the star power of McGregor. A lot of times there can be like, not a transfer of power, but an elevation of it. And he becomes a bigger star if he beats McGregor, but not substantively. Then you have a third fight with Aldo when it was just two fights ago where he already lost. It's just a really bad circumstance. Then you have McGregor being, and let's say he gets out-wrestled. Oh my God, what a disaster that would be. A total disaster. But we mentioned before, the converse is such an appealing position. I think that they're outside of the normal bounds of how they calculate risk and reward because of the moment, because they have to make a choice about making this event happen and meeting consumer demand. And if they don't, they're kind of screwed.
Yeah, and also before the fight was canceled, what we had was Conor McGregor against an injured Jose Aldo, right? So if McGregor went out there and beat up Aldo, there was always going to be this built-in excuse for the champ. So we'd have a new champion, but there would be an asterisk next to his name. And what's he got to do? He's got to turn around and fight either Chad Mendes or Frankie Edgar immediately. So we were going to see him tested against the one thing we've never seen him tested against, a wrestler, pretty quickly. It was going to happen. If it doesn't happen next weekend, it was going to happen by the end of the year. And yeah, he would have been a champion by that point, but he would have been a champion who had just beaten a guy who was halfway beaten already.
With Jose Aldo, you had the worst drawing pay-per-view headliner, I guess, going pretty close to it. And people have been talking about this a lot. With Conor McGregor, you potentially have the best possible pay-per-view draw going. Just put those two things together and you realize if Chad Mendes steps in there and becomes a monkey wrench to this whole scenario, it just shortens everything again. Part of the problem with Aldo being at the top and why people wanted him to go to 155 was for new challenges to open things up again in that division and to see what happens at lightweight. If he's still there and Mendes is the guy who's then holding a belt and they have to put those two back together, it just bottlenecks everything again. Frankie Edgar, everybody else. So in my mind, it just goes on and on. The sort of repercussion if Chad Mendes goes in there and wins. So yes, I think to get back to your original question, it's a pretty vulnerable spot for the UFC to put Mendes in there.
It's a moot point now, but you bring up Frankie Edgar, and I wonder if that was the right call, because if he wins, I think the rematch with Aldo is a lot more sellable than a third fight with Chad Mendes. And it's funny, they said that the reason why they picked Mendes was because he was the higher-ranked fighter, but then...
No, it was because Luke had said...
Oh, yes, that's right.
And to spite me.
Yes, to one of our favorite viewers.
That's so funny.
Mr. Lorenzo Fertitta. Hello,
He's
Lorenzo.
on his elliptical right now.
Yes, keep working. But, I'm still kind of surprised they went that way. And I love the fact that the rankings now changed and put Frankie above Chad Mendes. And sometimes we get the heat for that. I don't think any of us contribute to those rankings. Do you still kind of feel like they should have gone with Frankie over Chad? Or maybe, by the way, Chad is upset about that comment that McGregor said on that show last year, BT Sports Show, where he, said he'd rest his balls on his forehead. Yeah. But maybe that's what got him the fight, right? Maybe that's, at the end of the day, that beef is what got him the fight.
Well, I think that's partly what got him the fight. But also, that was what my tweet was about. It wasn't that I didn't think the UFC was going to do something, or that I was going to be surprised, because of the reason you just mentioned. Like Edgar, the rematch is better. Plus, if he gets it, he becomes a 2-division champion. That's something you can sell now,
True.
Right? So, it's an interim title, but hey, it counts.
Yeah.
Right? People love Frankie Edgar, and he was coming off of the Swanson win where he looked good. He was coming off of the Faber win where, he still won. But I think for some of the reasons that Lorenzo Fertitta highlighted, it kind of makes sense. I was there at that Fairfax fight. Chad Mendes looked like a new fighter. Like he did. He looked kind of reborn in a way where he had grown since the loss to Aldo. And so while from a promotional standpoint, I don't think there's a lot of reason to say, oh, Mendes versus Aldo 3, that's so exciting. I can see that fight being even more competitive the third time, in actuality, whatever the odds makers or the fans may say about it. So I think that was really it. And Edgar, I'll be honest, I'm not saying he couldn't give any of those guys a tough fight. I think he's starting to get a little bit old. I don't think he looked so awesome against Faber. He didn't look bad by any stretch of the imagination. He looked good, but he didn't look like Chad Mendes. Chad Mendes blew the doors off Ricardo Lamas. So for me, I think that momentum plus, the genitals on your face comment has some power.
Why'd you point to me?
And one of those rare situations where my respect has grown for everyone involved. My respect grows for Conor McGregor for taking this fight against a completely different opponent on 2 weeks' notice. My respect grows for Chad Mendes for also taking this fight. Big deal, yes, but let's not forget, he's taking a fight on 2 weeks' notice against a bitter rival, 5-round title fight. And it's not a 3-round fight. What kind of shape is he in? We're about to find out. My respect grows for Jose Aldo for making probably the toughest decision of his life. And all this, I'm not even getting into the scared stuff because it's completely ridiculous. But I mean, so much money was on the table for him, and now he's not getting it. And also, you know, you have to give props to the UFC for finally saying to everyone, all right, we're going to put our golden boy against a wrestler and roll the dice here, which sometimes they don't do. Like when John Jones got injured, they delayed the Daniel Cormier fight, even though it was after the big brawl and all that stuff. So it's one of those rare cases where I feel like everyone comes away looking pretty good.
Except maybe the guys in Nevada who are going to sanction the fight after seeing the Aldo X-rays.
Yeah.
I mean, other than those guys, but we never give those guys props. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that everybody across the board has really stepped up. And you know, McGregor. I mean, I've been very vocal in questioning where his place is, and you know, we're going to find out. And thanks to him, I mean, thanks to him, he had enough respect for his fans who are coming across the pond to see him perform. He just said, I'm going to go out there, and it doesn't matter who I'm fighting. And I got respect to that.
And I find the fight fascinating, equally fascinating as the Aldo, because you're dealing with two sublime strikers in one sense, and now you've got the wrestler question that we've been asking. So in some ways, I feel like it's like parallel. You know, they're both as compelling to me in my mind.
It should be noted though that like Aldo's taking a bit of heat, right? Not from us.
He is, yes.
But he's taking a bit of heat, and it's just so bizarre to me. First of all, I think the people who think that Jose Aldo is scared, it's like the same people who think Kimbo Slice versus Ken Shamrock was fixed, aka not smart people typically.
Donks?
Donks, yes, that's an optimal word for it, donks. So there's that. But I think even if that aside, there is this prevailing sense about, oh, Jose Aldo, you ruined things again. You ruined things for me by being injured. And look, is there an argument to be made that maybe they trained too rough at Novunia? Maybe there is. I'm not going to sit here and I wouldn't debate too hard about that. However, I also think that people just don't understand, biologically, some people just respond to injury better. Some heal faster. Some don't get injured quite as easily. There's a guy, and I mentioned this before, there's a guy in DC named Jordan Reed who's like this star tight end waiting to happen. He gets one hit, and he's a monster. He gets hit one time. Here's bruised ribs. Here's a high ankle sprain. Here's an MCL tear. It's persistent with him. I feel like Jose Aldo just biologically, like Fedor getting cut so easily, his body just doesn't handle injury maybe as well as some other people. People treating him pulling out his fight in a scenario where he does not win. He doesn't get any money. He doesn't get to go. He's not even going to Vegas. Nothing. He gets nothing out of this. Turning this into a character indictment is basically unethical.
Yeah, and I think that for the UFC to be disappointed in Aldo, I think that's totally fair. I mean, this is their business. Their business is riding on this, and he's not going to be there the night before. Now they came up with a really nice plan B, a fight that I'm really excited to see. But for them to have some disappointment is fair. But I think that for fans to lodge any of that kind of nonsense that you're talking about is not only stupid on the level you're talking about, but also just stupid on the side of just as a competitive, as a person interested in competition. I want to see McGregor at his best against Aldo at his best.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to see McGregor at his best. If McGregor goes out and beats a 50% Aldo, what does it really tell us? And so I want to see the best against the best.
I think part of it is at least some like parlayed consternation going back. Obviously, the UFC 176, where you had Aldo who was injured, that whole card goes away. You know how it is. It doesn't necessarily have to be fair. It just has to. You have to see a pattern emerging for it to become frustrating. And in some ways, I get why the UFC can be frustrated with Jose Aldo, even though you're right, we shouldn't be assassinating his character because these things happen. But you can see that they might be a little bit like, hey, how did he get injured? Well, somebody was on a spinning. You know, why is this stuff going on? Why aren't you wearing proper gear and things like that? So it's just one of those situations. But ultimately, I think some of that stuff for Jose Aldo is just the fact that we've seen it before. And regardless, they're all separate things, but it just sort of cumulatively gets it.
I just want to say real quickly, I don't know of a serious fight camp that doesn't do hard sparring 2 weeks out.
True. It's true.
Name it. ATT? Nope. AKA?
It's true.
Nope. Jackson's? Nope. What is this miraculous fight camp that produces champions that stops fighting a hard sparring 3 or 4 weeks out? It doesn't exist. So like that criticism to me is totally absurd.
The Fred Astaire Dance Studio does not do hard sparring.
Well, okay, they can go do Zumba and get in shape, I guess, but that's not going to help you fight in a cage.
I have a hard time begrudging the fans who are really upset about this because let's put ourselves in their shoes. Spend a lot of money, you want to see that fight, you're going to react. I get it. It may not be right, but I can understand them venting to a degree. You know where this kind of stings the most for me? that ad was so great. The one where they're walking, it was so great. And now the new ad is like the run-of-the-mill, generic.
I haven't seen it.
Oh my! It's like
There's a lot of
everyone's
oohs and
yelling.
ahs?
There's a lot of yelling. Do they just
They
have a
love
track?
yelling.
Can I just say, like, they do such great work, but do they just have like a track of yells that they just throw? I mean, come on, guys, we could do better than this.
You ever seen those old 1990s soundboards, like on ebombsworld.com?
Yeah.
Where you can click, and it feels like they just put footage over screaming.
So we went from
We
like
have Mendes walking down the street with a bunch of Californians.
We went from the Mona Lisa of UFC ads to your typical Fight Pass ad that we see all the time. That's where this one thing's like, oh man, we couldn't have done anything. Maybe something better is going to come in the next week or so.
We can't beat them up too hard about it, though. I mean,
it just stings.
It's Brock Lesnar's chicken ass to chicken salad. Or
I will say this though, the fact that this news came out last week and we had a week to almost get prepared for it. When the news finally did come out, it didn't hit me as hard as a fan, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Like mentally,
they had cushioned the blow.
Yeah,
I feel
sure.
like.
Maybe that was part of the plan from the get-go.
It was the best way to do it. I don't know. I mean, I want to meet this radiologist who saw this and was like, "This gentleman looks great," But at least setting up the potentiality of, look, here's what happens just in case, and then just having the natural circumstances we've talked about how good it can be with a Mendes fight. They made it easy.
Final point on all this, a tough year for Jose Aldo in the UFC, right? It was exactly, I think, a year ago today that he pulled out of UFC 176. And then,
Is it really?
Yeah, and then all the comments about the Reebok deal and now this. I can't imagine they're too pleased with him these days.
Yeah, I
That's
can
too
understand why. Listen, I'm beating up some of the fans, but to your point, I can see why UFC's a little like, oh my god,
Yeah.
come on, just make it there. But look, this is a tough sport. You're learning how to attack someone from head to toe. Bad things happen.
Okay, let's move along. Tuesday was a very interesting day for the UFC and the sport. They held this fashion show.
You were there.
I was there, as was Chuck, in the front row.
It's wonderful.
Fashion show / media availability of sorts to finally unveil the Reebok Fight Kit. And this was met with mixed reaction to be as kind as possible. Now that it has sunk in, what do we make of it? From the guy who was there,
Yeah.
What did you think of this presentation? And more importantly, the presentation isn't what matters. It's really what the product looks like and what this means for the sport. What did you make of it?
Well,
all?
honestly, being there,
Yeah.
it seemed okay. Like they're showing you. I was going around. I was talking to some of the fighters, just off record. And they're like, yeah, they're nice. They're really nice. Feel them. Touch the material. All this stuff. It didn't strike me as anything out of the ordinary. I was a little surprised that they sort of went with a very homogenized look. I thought there might be some really different looks going on, but they were all basically in the same vein. The champions, wearing black, though, I guess is the big variation there. So some of that stuff I was like, it just was a little underwhelming. But ultimately, I was like, they wanted to achieve sort of a streamlined, professional look. I was like, I guess I can see that. And I wrote a piece after it. I got some flack, I guess, afterwards about, gone are the skulls and all that. Which the MMA culture had sort of been known from like the Affliction and Tap Out and all these brands, and then the Condom Depot and all those side of things. I personally am not going to miss the days of that, and I'm not going to miss human billboards. To me, I'm like, if anybody really laments that's going away, I'm like, why? I don't understand that sort of criticism. I get that the fighters, I want them to make as much money as they possibly can. I get all that side of it, but from an aesthetic, I'm
Yes.
perfectly okay with it.
Yeah, well, actually, before I say anything about that, I just want to I know that when we start talking, the graphic comes up, but I just want to make sure you guys know that there's 2 F's in Jeff and there's 1 G in Wagenheim. Just make sure that somewhere down here it should have my name.
Hashtag.
Yeah, okay.
There it is.
Oh,
right
there it is. Okay, great. Anyway, and I'm with him on this. I won't miss I won't miss that sort of aesthetic that has permeated the sport. In fact, that's why I dress the way I do. I mean, I am an antagonist and a contrarian, so I dress the opposite of the people who go to these fights. But I also think that there was some high comedy this week with misspellings of fighters' names and people just raising a ruckus about sort of the peripheral stuff. It's all going to go away. We know that once you're able to go and buy replicas of Gilbert Melendez's shirt, it's going to have his name spelled correctly. So, but I know that he really didn't do this, but I could almost imagine this board meeting with the UFC and Reebok guys saying, well, we know that the internet's going to savage us somehow. So let's throw them a bone. Why don't we go and here's a list of names. Let's just see if we can misspell all these names, and then they'll focus all on that.
Ronaldo's.
Yeah, they won't focus on the substance of it. And the substance is that the sport wants to have a cleaner look, and they're looking, and you know, I know that both you guys spoke to Lorenzo Fertitta, and he talked a lot about wanting to look to the future of the sport. And I realized that in the short term, the fighters, a lot of fighters are complaining about less money, but in the future, there are going to be different kinds of opportunities, and these guys, for their interest, for the UFC's interest, and for Reebok's interest, they're playing to their interest, which is to try to create that cleaner look.
Yeah. I'm trying not to be too negative because Lord knows I am, generally speaking. I'm a misanthrope and I want everyone to die. That aside, not you guys, but you know.
Thank you.
Everyone else.
The guys back here? Okay. Let me say this. They'll get better, right? This is the first time they're trying to do this. And I think if the Fight Pass thing showed us anything, now Fight Pass was different because it was rushed, but Fight Pass is a pretty good product now. Is it perfect by any stretch? No. But if you compare Fight Pass now to what it was when it launched, I mean, it's categorically better. Okay, so I trust the ability of UFC and Reebok to iterate in a way that makes things better for all the parties involved. I'll say that up front. That being said, like the number of just, where do I even start? It's conceptually unimaginative. Who did the spell checking? Pootie Tang? You better sign those papers on the running, Kai. Sarate, UFC. Like who? Giblert, Melendez, like flexibility on the thing. Like, it was so badly executed on that level. But to me, the fundamental thing, and you can quibble with the aesthetic. I admit it's a cleaner look, and I said it's like 5 years from now they might start putting out some badass kits. I completely can buy that idea. But the major problem is because people were asking, well, these guys are going to start wearing these. Well, no. What are the top things that they're selling? It's a replacement for your walkout shirt, basically. That's basically what, for guys and girls, for the most part. Okay? Why did you turn it into a sports jersey where you have this blaring UFC logo and then a mild nod to the fighter on the back? That is totally not how fight walkout shirts work at all. It is literally backwards from how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be something symbolic, something unique. And when you are a fight fan of a BJ Penn or a Buchecha or whatever, you want to walk around and you want to parade this person everywhere. That's what it is. And there is none of that. Zero. None. All identity completely washed from it unless you are a champion. And okay, I like the black on gray kits. It's kind of cool. It's kind of running man thing. I get it. But to me, when you had guys who had different symbols and McGregor's fighting Irishmen, I'm not saying you had to bar that over, but there has to be some kind of nod. And by the way, the color country thing, I think that's a good idea. But you've got Korea, Japan, Russia, and Canada, all versions of white, red, and black. Oh my God! Like, there's just so many problems with it. So look, here's what I'm going to say. I'm gonna just wrap it all up. I'm gonna just say this was a botched attempt, and I will look to future kits to be better as they incorporate feedback.
Why do we have to use the word kit, by the way?
Because they don't want to use the word uniform.
Do you think that's?
I think they're also going to be starting a UFC soccer team. They're going to be in the
Dana White hates soccer. Remember?
It should be football then, right? If we're using the word kit.
Yeah.
Uses the word kit in America.
Yeah. Yeah, and by the way, if someone asked me this, why is Cain Velasquez like Mexican? I can see why he would pick that, but do you get a choice over it? Because Anthony Pettis is first generation Latino. Why is he American? I
will say that I agree with that. I'm not sure if the fighters had any say in that. I did ask about the names and why, for example, to me, the craziest one of them all is CM Punk, because that's a name that actually...
Whose name was also spelled wrong.
Was Phillip Brooks. I mean, it's not even Phil Brooks. It's like, this is what his mom calls him, right?
Yeah. Social Security card.
Yeah. Well, actually, from what I was told, there was some kind of, real debate where they had to go with legal names. That's why Beck Rawlings is Rebecca Rawlings. It's what's on their passport. So they went with that. Now, it doesn't explain, Ronaldo or Jacare Ronaldo, things of that nature. But I hope that they understand that if you want to actually sell these jerseys to people, you can't sell Phillip Brooks, CM, right. Things of that nature. But I find that, and I agree with your point, I find the most troubling part of the whole situation, a lot of fighters did tell me they were blown away by the actual feel.
Yes.
I'm sure it's quality made.
Yeah, they were actually pleasantly surprised and actually very excited to use this stuff. But when I was talking to Dana White about this, I was really surprised. It's not news that he feels this way. To me, the beauty of combat sports, among many other things, has always been, Tyson walking out with the black shorts and the black shoes,
And
no
the cutoff,
socks.
the
Yeah.
cutoff
Yeah.
sweater.
I loved when Floyd Mayweather came out dressed as a Mexican against Oscar De La Hoya. Dana said that he hated Henry Cejudo coming out with the Aztec gear. I love that
know.
stuff.
I
I
agree
love
with
that
you 100% on
pageantry.
that stuff.
And I'm sad that that's going away.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean,
that's-
100%. We've talked about this before. Fighters are fighters because they are individuals. They did not. A lot of them, like the Little Exchange, they did not want to be in team sports. They wanted to be who they were, to express themselves, to fail and to succeed on their own dime. It's like. So this is an extension of that. Is that little part? I know a lot of people really think about their walkout. That's the moment for a lot of people. It's like they made it. They're at the stage. They're going to the stage. So it should incorporate as much of their personality as it possibly can. And you're mentioning some of these iconic figures like Mike Tyson. I mean, that was part of his. That was part of the
100%.
thing. You saw him walk out, and you're like, here he comes. Look at the savage. Coming out here to do work. So. I wish they would have figured something like that out. What I'm talking about is just the billboards, just all that stuff. I'm happy to see that go away, but I'm not happy to see the individuality go away.
When Mike Tyson was fighting, though, none of us here could tell me whether he was the WA champion, the WBC champion. I mean, nobody really cared about any of the organizations that sanction boxing. So when we're comparing MMA to boxing, as combat sports, it's kind of an uneven comparison because. Face it, the UFC is the biggest star in the UFC. I mean,
That's a self-reinforcing thing.
Well, sure, but there has to be, and I think that's what they're prepared to do. They're prepared. I mean, I only wish they could put the UFC logo a little bigger on the fighter uniform.
I mean, you could have a child covering it, and the letters would still be bigger. Like a toddler is not even big enough to cover this thing.
And of course, there's the issue of the price, right? For the casual fan, are they really going to pay this much money, $95 or so?
Especially for something when you walk down the street, it just says UFC on it and Reebok. Hold on, one more point. They made a lot to do about, we had a lot of fighter input on this. That is not a credible claim. It's just not credible. How can you look at something up front and just says one after the other in gigantic letters,
But they should run
UFC,
Ronda
UFC.
up on this thing, kind of
Jose,
going through
you
it.
mean to tell me you couldn't shrink UFC and put Vi Cavallo on front, Rowdy on front? You couldn't do RDA on front. You couldn't do that, really? To me, this was clearly something that they designed in their minds because they think the brand is the most important thing, and it's hugely important. I would never ever undercut that. However, it is not so important that you just stick Conor McGregor's name on the back.
Right.
It makes no sense whatsoever.
But I think, to be fair, when they were talking about, at least the way I interpreted it, when they were talking about eliciting fighter input, it was about how does this feel when I'm stretching, when McGregor's throwing a spinning kick, do the shorts bulk up on him, like all the material things. I mean, in terms of the design, I forgot who it was, but somebody on Twitter said something like we should have more input. Fighters should have more input in the designs, and someone said, fighters aren't designers, and I get that. I think there should be some. I understand what you're saying, but I think that you hit it with the first thing you said, which is. Just like Fight Pass, this stuff it's a work in progress. I mean, we're not going to see all the typos and all that nonsense. I guarantee you, if you go to the last story that I wrote on SI.com, you'll find typos of stories any of you guys do here at MMA Fighting. There are typos. It just the aesthetics of print these days are just not as stringent. It just isn't the way it is.
They did rush this. I mean, from people that I spoke to.
But everybody rushes stuff. That's what I'm saying.
They said it took them 6 months to do something that really should have taken more like 18 months. And for whatever reason, they wanted to roll it out now. One of the big winners, by the way, of this whole experience has been Condom Depot. How many times does that name get brought up every time we're talking? Like I've heard the name Condom Depot more times in the last month than in the last 2-3 years. I'm reminded of the great Michael Jordan commercial, Like Mike, the Gatorade commercial. And that wasn't really a commercial for Gatorade. It was great for them. It was iconic. But what was being like Mike all about? It was having a shaved head. It was having baggy shorts. It was the tongue out. It was the grip thing that he had on his leg.
And the ability to jump through the gym.
It was about his logo.
Yeah.
It was about his shoes. And this is a part of sports. There's a great brand called Nomas, and they do these replica, Cassius Clay shirts that he wore, that Muhammad Ali wore back in the day when he was known as Cassius Clay, as his training camp shirt. They've done it with Leon Spinks and many other fighters. I'm afraid of all that going away. Fans want to look up to their heroes, their favorite athletes, their fighters, and now we don't have that anymore.
This goes all the way back though when they first announced this whole alliance. I mean, this was the type of thing that you thought about right then, like, wow, what does this mean? What are we taking away? This seems kind of crazy to, just sign this thing and everybody homogenized into a certain look. It's just because I remember being on this panel and discussing this very thing. Just the individuality. How will that be affected? And now we have our
I think it would have been okay if the shorts were that look that they present. That's fine, but the shirts and all that stuff feels like it's. I don't know, it feels like a step too far, and this is a major, major undertaking for the UFC. I mean, you really think about what they're doing here as far as like the fight week stuff and the locker rooms. I mean, look, kudos to them. They're giving this a go, and this is something they feel very strongly about. But I do believe, and that's why I'm not even that quick to judge this, truly. And I know it was, like a firing squad on Tuesday. To an embarrassing degree, if you ask me, but that's a whole different story for a different day. I do believe that this will change. And that's what I said to Dana White, to his face. I think that this will evolve over time.
Here's how you know it's going to change. Because the minute someone in Reebok and UFC, let's take Cain Velasquez, and let's say they make a shirt that has, I don't know, I'm just making something up, Brown Pride on the front of it, it's going to sell way better.
Yeah.
And so they're going to, oh, well, wait a second, we can make more money doing this, let's make some of those adjustments. I think that's going to be the revelatory moment for them.
I wonder if, at first, the initial intention wasn't to sell jerseys, it was to clean up the sport. And in their mind,
that's
they've
really
accomplished this.
Yes.
The other stuff appears to be gravy, but I think over time, enough fighters will speak out, they will talk. I mean, Conor McGregor, like you said, that thing has become somewhat, iconic to him, and it's weird to not see that anymore.
More the empty
People
canvas.
want that.
They're clearing off all the condom depot, and then
there it is again.
It's time to be more human, fellas.
Again, to just not be the most negative thing in the world. Your first draft of anything sucks. My first draft of anything I write or video sucks. But I do believe in their ability to edit.
Yeah, and hopefully that's the case. Hopefully they're listening. I actually really sort of feel for the Reebok people who I know truly care about the sport, and of course there's money involved here. But from all the people I've met, very, very nice and thoughtful and talented people. And then you look at some of the tweets and the mentions that they're getting. It has to be initially a bit disheartening to see all this venom spewed their way, right?
One quick note, shouts to Zane Simon, who wrote an article looking at different MLS teams and organizations in soccer and wherever else, and their how much the money that the deals are worth. If you look at the deal that they have $70 million over 6 years, it's somewhere between LA Galaxy and a general MLS kit deal. And his point was the bigger kit deals typically have better fan reception because these are more thoughtful. These are more, the more a team has a chance to iterate, the better that they get themselves and the more fans get receptive to it. So he says I think he made a point that when the next deal comes out, let's say it's like $140 million over 6 years, you'll see a higher level of artistic craftsmanship.
Okay, let's move along. And speaking of this deal, I don't want to necessarily talk about this angle, but when it came out, Josh Koscheck, incredibly vocal negatively towards the deal. There was a jersey with his name on it apparently, and he said this wasn't, part of my old deal with the UFC, and it appears as though that jersey has been taken away. But the big news, of course, regarding Josh Koscheck is he has signed with Bellator. And I'm wondering what you guys think of this deal, given Bellator in 2015 and what they're doing and the ratings that they got with Kimbo versus Shamrock. What was your reaction when you found out that Josh Koscheck, longtime UFC fighter, is now taking his talents to Spike TV?
One of total shock. No, I was just the opposite. It made 100% sense, especially coming on the heels of their big ratings of Kimbo and Ken Shamrock. You're like, well, of course, first thing that goes through your mind is, isn't Paul Daly still on their roster? And that was the very first thing I thought of was, Now they get Josh Koscheck, forget about his 5-fight losing streak, forget that he's been finished 4 times in a row. They're thinking about a vendetta that they can put under a tent pole like they've been talking about, and you've got a nice fight. The two guys don't like each other. And I actually talked to Josh Koscheck a couple of days back, and immediately he's calling Paul Daly names. They're setting the table for that thing. From that aspect, it's just that's par for the course for 2015 in Bellator. So I wasn't shocked at all. Would I have liked to have seen Koscheck sort of retire? Probably. I mean, I didn't, even after the Ellenberger fight, I was at that point, and he takes that other fight 3 weeks later. He just gets finished pretty immediately by Eric Silva, and it's just, you feel like he doesn't really have it anymore. But that's been Bellator's sort of thing, is dusting off these guys, putting them in there, and doing these vendetta fights.
Yeah, you got to sort of wonder what is Bellator looking at. They're scooping up guys who are no longer with the UFC, and on the one hand, a guy like Phil Davis, you understand why the UFC didn't hang on to him. They didn't feel like he was a real exciting fighter, but he certainly was a fairly successful fighter. A guy who could handle himself in the octagon. But then you get a guy like Josh Koscheck, who is at the tail end and hasn't looked. It's not just that he's getting knocked out in the end. It's like all through his fights, he just looks like he's waiting to get knocked out in his fights. It just doesn't look like the guy that I remember seeing when he was at his best. And it's kind of sad to watch him compete. And if his last fight in the UFC had been the end, I'd have been like, okay, well, he had a good career and it ended badly, but you really were something else when you were in your prime. But now we're going to see a whole new iteration of him, and it's kind of sad to see.
I don't love it. I don't hate it. I think, just to correct the record, though, his last 2 fights were Ellenberger, where he foamed at the mouth, and then Eric Silva.
Yep.
He got submitted against Eric Silva, didn't he? Okay, so he didn't get
He
blared.
was knocked out the 2 fights prior to that.
Right.
And took that fight on super short notice.
Right. I mean, it was a back-to-back thing almost. Yeah, okay. I just want to make sure, though. Okay, so here's how I feel about it. Look, if they can match him up, I mean, Paul Daly didn't look awesome in his last fight either, just to call it what it is. If he can get into a fight, not take a whole lot of damage, get out, make a paycheck, I'm not going to have too much issue, Okay. If he goes in there and just gets, stretched, that to me seems very problematic. And I know that's like, you're judging after the fact kind of scenario. I'm not sure how else to judge it. I think what I saw in his last 2 fights against Ellenberger and Silva, comes out first round, looks good, but has no second gear to move into against guys who are at the top of the division now these days. That's not who he's facing anymore in Bellator. So now there's the Douglas Limas of the world, and he's pretty badass. But short of that, can he take down Koreshkov? Yeah, he can pretty easily, I think. So I'm not as worried for his safety in that regard. I think the funny thing to me was, and this is neither pro Bellator nor anti-UFC because I would apply it to both parties. He said something kind of interesting. Fight out your contract and find out what you're worth. Yes, you should. And if Bellator wants to sign you from UFC, they should pay for it. And if UFC wants to sign you from Bellator, they should pay for it. And I am all okay with that.
Well, look at what's going on in the NBA right now. I
mean, my God. Well, except for the Knicks.
We had to go there. Paul Pierce going to do well in LA next year, isn't he? But I mean, look, guys are testing the market, and they're making an incredible amount of money. To me, what came to mind right off the bat, it's the same thing I thought when they signed Aaron Pico. It's the same thing I thought when they signed Phil Davis. It's the same thing I thought when they signed Ed Ruth. The Zinkin, Scott Coker relationship continues to grow. Josh Koscheck, a Zinkin guy. Bob Cook's his guy. Bob Cook used to be a matchmaker for Strikeforce. This is, when Josh Thompson becomes a free agent rather soon, I wouldn't be surprised if he tests that market as well. And so on and so on. Now, I don't expect Daniel Cormier or Cain Velasquez or Luke Rockhold, the cream of the crop guys, to leave the UFC anytime soon. I would be shocked if that happened right now. But this is another example of Scott Coker and Zinkin coming together. And who knows what else is going to happen. I mean, they don't have that many guys left that they can actually go after. But that's what came to mind. And also, this is a guy who started on Tough One. Yeah. He made Tough One what it was. You know about that better than most.
I was going to say, one of the big fights they could put together would be to put Stephan Bonner against Josh Koscheck. I don't know how they
remember
would
that.
Yes, of course. So, I mean, but you would have that angle, that whole angle. It's Spike TV, right? That was a Spike TV.
Do you think they come calling for Chris Lieben?
Wow. I haven't thought about Chris Lieben.
You don't have to call too loudly, I don't think.
But that's a rivalry. That's a tough one guy as well.
That's true.
I think the question is, how big is that daily rematch? Promoted correctly?
Yeah.
It's fairly big. I don't think you could headline a card with
Paul
it, but
Daly
you
is
can
in
come main event.
Bellator, maybe not Bellator specifically, but he's out of the UFC specifically because of that fight. He's been banished from them before that fight.
You're not going to have any of that footage, right? You can't.
No.
You can't promote it.
You can use photos. I was on MMA Uncensored. I know about these tricks.
They will do enough. I'm not sure if they can because that was somewhat of a news show. This is for promotional, so I don't know if they have that angle, but they could get around it very easily. I mean, the back and forth.
They will find a way.
They'll find a way.
The big takeaway, nothing's off limits for Bellator at this point. I mean, the fact that Dada 5000, or whatever his name is even in play here to fight.
Oh my God, I forgot about
Kimbo.
that.
I mean, nothing is off limits. Herschel Walker, from Herschel Walker to Gina Carano to Stephan Bonn. I mean, I think anyone's fair game for them these days because of the ratings that they're getting as a result of these matchups.
I guess what bothers me about it is that we end up talking about these kind of fights that really don't mean anything in the larger picture, and then people who just go out there and do their job and are great, just. We don't have time for those folks because these are these guys have built up a name, and nothing against Koscheck. I'm not aiming anything toward him. I mean, he was an excellent fighter in his time, but this is not his time.
That is a nice nod to the fans who wanted to see us talk about Joanna Jędrzejczyk last week, right? I mean,
yes,
someone
I wanted to show off my ability to say Jędrzejczyk, which I didn't get a chance to do last week.
Someone who definitely deserves a lot of time, but we actually don't have a lot of time to talk about it this week. We need to move along to Yoel Romero, who had a fantastic performance, the best of his career by far, completely annihilated Lyoto Machida. It took him some time, a little bit of time to figure him out, but then he won in convincing fashion, and then marred the victory to a certain extent. Whether or not he said what everyone thought he said, the fact that this was what people were talking about after the fight, put a bit of a black cloud over it. Now that we've had a chance to digest it, move on, other things have happened. Do you feel like this was as bad as we thought? Do you feel like, this truly has hurt him because he was even in that discussion? People were accusing him of pretty offensive remarks, or do you think that come the next time he fights, we'll have forgotten about it and all will be forgiven?
I think it'll be forgiven for the most part, or at least not explicitly held against him. If you know anyone who speaks English as a second language, they'll tell you that trying to articulate themselves in English, even when they're fluent, can be a challenge, because you don't understand. If you speak another language, you dream in that language, you think in that language, and sometimes you have to transliterate. I can't understand his Spanish, much less his English. It's just impossible to get. So I think that tie goes to the runner. I think over time, most people will do that. And the other thing is, you look at the ratings, they came out, they were pretty good, but it looked like they got a bump from the Women's World Cup coverage. Our own Dave Meltzer talked about that, and they had declined over the course of the show a little bit. So there were more people watching earlier in the show than the main event. I think ultimately that's what the bigger question here is. Forget about what Yoel Romero said. Were enough people watching this experience for it to really be the proper buoy to the next event? Probably, but I don't think that the post-fight comments in and of themselves were so ruinous that it has destroyed his ability to leapfrog.
I think everyone has gotten over the idea that he was being offensive towards same-sex marriage. I think there is a case to be made potentially that that's what he was referring to, but until someone actually asks him that question, I don't think it's fair to go there. I think what's interesting is what Dana White said on Tuesday is, look, you just won the biggest fight of your life. Why are you even going out there to preach? Why are you talking about Jesus? Talk about your fight, talk about your next opponent, etc. And I think there's a case to be made that that's not the time or place. I think what people have to remember is this is a guy who calls himself soldier of God. This is a deeply, deeply religious man. To us, it may not seem like the time or place. To him, This is the time and place. He is fighting to be able to preach to the world about. That's the way he thinks. So I don't think look, they may not be happy and they have every right not to be happy. It's their show. But I don't understand the people who can't comprehend that to a deeply religious man who walks around with a John 3:16 headband, who calls himself soldier of God, he is doing all this fighting stuff in order to get the platform, to be on the platform to talk about this. That's what we have to remember.
Totally. I mean, it was totally the time and place because of exactly who he is. But it's also, that is why I think it's totally fair to criticize him. It's totally fair to walk up, to turn your back on this guy and say you are talking about, then you go into a press conference and say I was talking about the American dream when a half hour ago you were out there and in the octagon, trying to deprive half the population or some segment of the population of the American dream of getting married and settling down. I mean, I think it's.
Do you think that's what he was referring to?
Yeah, I don't think I didn't buy the gay Jesus thing or whatever, but I felt like the tone of what he said. Well, I mean, I Yes, I was offended, but I don't feel. I mean, I feel people should be able to say what they want to say, but I also feel like I should then, as a consumer, say I'm not interested in going to your store to buy my groceries if I think that you're.
Do you view him any differently?
Well, I mean, yes, I guess I do. I mean, I always knew that he was a guy who wore his faith on his sleeve, but there are a lot of people. I know a lot of people who are very, very devout Christians and devout in other religions as well, but they don't go out there and try to run the world for other people. And so, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not interested in the guy.
My thoughts were, don't do it. Don't do it, Romero.
Yeah.
Don't do it, Romero, because you could see him start to, oh no, USA, whatever. And I was like, oh, this is not good. Wherever he's going, you knew it was not going to be good. So, what an interesting sort of thing that's come of this, and maybe this goes back to Al Iaquinta's thing and all this, but it's interesting. There's this extra level now of drama that's coming from these post-fight interviews. I mean,
especially when John Anik is involved.
It's true. Poor John Anik.
Right?
But we've seen a couple of things recently, and I guess if anything, it tells you that platform does matter in a weird sense. It's like you should think about maybe how you want to use that platform in a big victory like that. I don't know. I agree with you 100%. I don't think it really carries over to his next fight. People are just going to hear Romero against Jacare or whatever it's going to be, and that's what they're going to think about. Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say is, in this particular case, I think Dana is right. Saying like, dude, what are you doing? Build off what you just built.
Sure.
Like, do that. But in some cases, like, do you remember when Clay Guida won at the Fairfax show and he invited Obama to come wrestle him or something?
Yes.
And everyone was like, what the hell did you just say? That's fun stuff, man.
Sure.
Like, I do want some guys to know when it's their time to talk about the fight. And then I want other guys to just be the crazy donks that they are and just say whatever's on their mind, because it's the combination thing of the two, not homophobia, of course, but I mean,
Sure.
inviting Obama to wrestle you or whatever. That's the cool one.
Or the glassectomy joke.
Yeah, the glassectomy.
As much as Twitter overreacts to everything and overreacted to this, or reacted at least to this, I didn't see I saw much more criticism of Romero than I saw very little homophobia on the MMA portion of Twitter, which I thought was actually a good thing. I mean, I would have thought the other. I would have thought people would have been sort of like joining forces with him, and suddenly, all of his Reebok shirts would have been selling out
What you think of our demographic, huh?
Well,
Come on.
He does have a 1980s, early 1980s pro wrestling heel vibe to him, like against Tim Kennedy, his post-fight interview. Remember, he's talking, everyone's showering with booze. He's completely oblivious to it all. And here he's like, he's got this Cuban defector. I'm going to tell you all how it's going to be. Come join me in Jesus. It's very Iron Sheik-esque.
Yeah,
if you ask me.
I hadn't really
especially
thought
with
of
his
that.
accent.
I hadn't really thought of that, but I guess he is sort of controversial his last couple of fights. That's crazy. I didn't really put that together.
The Iron Sheik is Iranian.
No, but I'm talking about a pro wrestling heel, like a foreigner telling Americans the way they should.
But I
run
think
their
he's
lives.
oblivious to it.
Yeah, that's the great part about
if
it.
you asked him, I think pro wrestling guys, they kind of
Sure.
like bait him. I think Romero just walks around not realizing.
I love that.
Everyone's giving him the finger down the street. He's like, hey.
That's great. You have to no-sell it. All right, let's end on this note. It is International Fight Week. It's a big week for the UFC. We talked about that. There's a lot going on, from Invicta on Thursday, UFC 189 on Saturday, and then Tough Finale on Sunday. Side note, feel free to disagree with me here for a second. I really feel like they should put the Tough Finale on Friday to lead in to the 100, right? I mean, after
100%.
fact, it feels like you're kind of sticking around at the party a little too long, right? And you can use the free show to plug the pay-per-view, right?
BJ Penn's last performance, so the place was dead in there.
Incredibly depressing.
Yes, it was.
But that was BJ Penn. I mean,
this is added to it.
walkout.
If it was Friday, if the BJ Penn thing would have happened on Friday, everyone would say, well, all right, we got 175 coming up. Ronda, Chris Weidman. But after the fact, it just feels a little weird.
It was very depressing.
That wasn't my point, but I do want to talk about BJ Penn. It's a big weekend for him, and he's doing some media, and it's a little strange because it still feels like he's very sad about how it all ended, the fact that he can't be a fighter. I actually thought my colleague on the MMA Hour put it perfectly, New York Rick. He said this is a guy who really can't be around MMA. He can't be Forrest Griffin, he can't be Chuck Liddell. I just think that, and I agree with him 100%, it hurts him too much. At least right now, it hurts him too much. It's still too fresh for him. But I want to celebrate this guy before we go, because he's going to be inducted July 11th. The UFC is revamping their Hall of Fame experience. We spoke about that. I think we're all sort of on board with that idea. And I know you're a big fan of his as well.
Huge.
When you think of BJ Penn, what's the one memory that sticks out?
BJ Penn to me was the first fighter who did everything. right? Because if you remember BJ in his prime, his very peak, folks don't remember this because after the Diaz fight, you were like, oh, he got lumped up. He used to never cut. He used to never bruise. He had borderline perfect takedown defense. He had a Freddie Roach trained jab, and oh, by the way, was the first American to ever win the Jiu-Jitsu World Championship. When he was in his prime, it was amazing. And we talk about post-fight interviews. Go to bjpenn.com, bang, and coming out just scrap and fighting in 2 weight classes. Like he was everything. He was everything. And one of my favorite things I ever did when I used to work on Bloody Elbow was I don't know if I put together or maybe Chris Nelson, I can't remember, but someone put together a post, I think it was after the Diego Sanchez fight, where he just, was unstoppable. And it was a before and after of all of BJ's opponents of how different their faces looked after fights, because he used to disfigure them, literally disfigure them. He changed Diego Sanchez after that fight. Diego talks about the depression he went into because he had never had someone hurt him so badly. That, and then licking the blood. Oh my God! BJ Penn for a time in my life was like the king of alpha males. He was the guy. And when he was 155 pounds, if you thought about it, I mean, what's better than that, right?
I agree.
I remember early on, really early on, in the time that I was watching the fights. I mean, I remember obviously I watched the UFC fights back from UFC 1, 2, 3, but at some point I sort of lost interest. I wasn't writing about the sport, but I watched the fight when he was going against I think it was Cal Uno, and I might be misremembering some of these the facts, but as I remember, Uno came charging across right at the beginning, sort of said, I don't know, like a flying knee or something, and BJ just basically sidestepped and pow, 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 and it was over. I mean, I don't remember, I'll say, within 10 seconds, the thing was over. And prior to that, I mean, I had heard the name BJ Penn, but I saw this like babyface guy, and I thought, oh, it'd be sort of interesting to see how this guy, does in a fight, but it didn't really look like a guy that would be a tough killer. And all of a sudden, within 10 seconds, he just changed my entire perception of the sport in a way, because he just it's like a switch hit, and he just went for it, and it was over. And it was like, wow. I mean, I just remember just sitting back there, not even being able to say a word about it, and that was it. And ever since then, I've always not wanted to miss a BJ Penn fight.
Yeah. I thought it was great that the sport was trying to clean up. It was trying to come out of these dark ages, trying to come out of this old, primal, whatever you want to call it, lawless ground. And here's BJ Penn, who's still starring in it, that's dragging some of that barbaric side back into the into the current times. Just like you said, licking the blood, doing all that stuff. His fight, I think it was UFC 58 with George St. Pierre, where he won that first round. He ended up losing the fight. He made the whole comments about, he went to the hospital, I went to the bar. It was that type of thing. It was that kind of attitude. And I remember the lead up to UFC 94 when they were going to do the rematch, and they were running that. And I just remember, because he was fighting it. This was the only big super fight that we've had. At the time, especially, it just seemed like a big deal. And just thinking about him going to challenge GSP again, where he'd kind of come from. Like, he'd fought Renzo Gracie, he'd fought Lyoto Machida. I mean, he wanted us to drag that attitude into whatever he was going to do, and just his, non-balking, like going into that fight, just as BJ Penn, I just remember thinking there will never be another BJ Penn, even though he didn't. That fight wasn't his greatest fight. I just remember thinking in the build-up to that fight, like, wow, man, this is one of those guys you're going to remember.
Real quickly, because I know we're running out of time, he was a trained feral animal. That's what he was. Yeah. He was that lion for just temporarily you were able to cage and do tricks. Because with BJ, the best part about him was in Rampage Jackson goes, I'm a fighter, not an athlete. And and people look at St. Pierre and like he's an athlete, not a fighter. When he was at his best, you never had to make the choice. He was always both. Remember him jumping out of the pool? Yeah. 3 feet, he used to say on the video. Remember that? He was a ridiculous athlete who was a deranged man. And so when you gave this guy the ability to do jiu-jitsu, and he could punch his ass off, and he could take down defense, the whole bit, and he's also a ridiculous athlete, he in that moment, it was, the perfect guy at that time. When he was at his best, no one was better.
100%. Ronda Rousey referred to Ioana Jędrzejczyk recently as a fighter's fighter, and I really think he was the first fighter's fighter. I mean, I think every single fighter looked up to this guy, the way he would step up regardless of weight class. And I agree, when he was at 155, I'll never forget early on in my career sitting at the post-fight press conference in Memphis, UFC 107, after his beatdown of Diego Sanchez, splitting him open and thinking, like, this is very much the best fighter in the world. At 155, he's the best fighter in the world, and what I just saw was special, and I'll always remember it. Like, what he did to Diego that day, and of course what he did to Sean Shirk and Joe Stevenson, that run there when he reinvented himself once again at 155 was truly a special run. Like, during that period, I mean, I think after 94, things changed a little bit. I know he came back to beat Kenny Florian, but that period right there, he was so damn good. And I know next week is a big week for the UFC, and 189 is, you know, the crown jewel of it all, but I don't care what I'm doing, what my obligations are, I'm going to make my way to the expo because I think it's going to be very emotional. I think for him, he doesn't really want to be inducted. I don't think he's ready because I think it sort of signifies the end, and I think it's going to be very special. And I'm happy that it's a different kind of Hall of Fame. You know, I think it's cool that they're doing it with him right off the bat. And by the way, some breaking news, some exclusive news to the MMA Beat. They're switching things up. You know, they announced yesterday that Matt Hughes is going to be inducting BJ Penn, which I think is pretty cool considering their history. And I really think that for the first time in a long time, the UFC is honoring its past the right way. Mm-hmm. Guys like Don Fry are going to be at the expo. Renzo Gracie, not a big part of the UFC, but, you know, MMA legends. It's time they do this. And the right people are involved. How about this? Jeff Blatnick is going to be inducted.
Yes.
A guy who wasn't inducted, wasn't even thought of as a potential inductee in the old Hall of Fame. The guy who's inducting him, this is the breaking news, not huge to the casual fans, this won't make headlines, but it's Nick Lembo. And that to me...
The Jersey Commissioner.
Yes,
yeah.
Longtime friend. That to me is, all right, they're starting to get the history. They're starting to understand that this is a sport that has a rich history, despite the fact that it's young. These are things that fans like, you know?
If you ever tweet anything about Jeff Blatnick, Nick Lembo always retweets it. Always. He'll find it and retweet it.
That's going to be cool.
That's super cool.
I'm
That's
excited.
awesome. Cool.
Yeah, I'm excited about that stuff. So next week is a huge week for our sport. It's International Fight Week. It's Conor McGregor versus Chad Mendes. It's not Jose Aldo, but there's a ton of silver linings there. Of course, there's also Invicta and the tough finale. And don't forget about the Fan Expo. That's right before UFC 189. I kind of wish they did it on a Friday, by the way. You know, I feel like it should have it. You know, if it's right before 189, I feel like it gets lost in the shuffle
So
of the
I'll
event.
tweet the opposite and see if Lorenzo does it to spite me.
We'll see. How about that? We're off next week because of all those events. We're back in 2 weeks. I am sure we will have a lot to talk about.
Yeah,
wow.
for sure.
Maybe.
Yes. The beat goes on, my friends. For now, we say goodbye. That is Luke. That is Jeff. That is Chuck. I am Ariel. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Enjoy the fights.